cast into prison for doing the very work of God Himself. He was called upon the scene as the prophet of the ages. In a time when no one else had a word from God, it seemed like John the Baptist had a relevant word from God. This John the Baptist stood on the banks of the Jordan River and looked across the river, and he was the first to testify, "Behold, the Lamb of God, which takes away the sin of the world." He was the first person to see Jesus as who He was, as who He came to be. He was the first person to realize the Lamb of God. Many people have thought that a lion was coming. They thought the king was coming. They thought a lot of things was coming. But John held the full revelation of who Jesus really was and what He really came to do. As a lamb, He would come as a substitutionary death. He would come and be slain upon an old rugged cross or an altar in Old Testament terms as you would. He would come and give His blood so that we could live and have life more abundantly. It wasn't just that we needed Jesus, it was that we had to have Jesus. When Jesus appears upon the scene, He appears on the scene as nobody else. He doesn't act like any different than anybody else. And all of a sudden, He's at a wedding one day. And they need some wine. And He turns the water into wine. And He starts His ministry with a miracle. All the way throughout the text of the Bible, the people are trying to figure out what gave distinction to these men of God that lived in biblical times. What gives them the power? Uncle Bobby's been preaching on Samson the last few times I've heard him preach. He preached about Samson. And the one thing that they always wanted to know is, how does Samson get his strength? Where does his strength come from? How do these people keep doing what they're doing? It's a touch from God that gives them that power. It's obedience to God that gives them that power. It's faith, if you will, in this last day that gives them the covenant power with God to do the acts of God inside of this little ball we call earth. It will only take God to live in these last days. As John was sitting in a jail cell for doing the will of God, John stood up one day as Herod come rolling by in a chariot, threw the gospel gun out there and said, "You shall not have your wife. For the law has said that adultery is a sin against God." And Herod's wife hated John from that time forth. John was thrown into prison. Being bound up for a little while, John began to sit there and think. Now, it doesn't say how long he was there. It doesn't really matter how long he was there, but I'm sure as the days become